Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together. Hey friends, hey, and welcome to the Stitch Please podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Woolfork. And as I say every week, this is a very special episode because this episode, we are talking about thread. We talked about pins and needles before, and now we are talking about thread. Thread is just as essential to the sewing process as are needles and pins. And so I thought it was important to spend some time helping you get situated with your thread situation. Get it? Stitchuation, like situation, but with stitching. Y'all get it. It's punny and it's funny. So let's get our stitch together today. And you know what else I'm going to tell you? I'm going to let you know why your grandmother was right to keep her thread in one of those Danish cookie tins. Yes, I can acknowledge that you were gaslit during childhood because you thought there was cookies in there and it was never cookies. But there was a very good reason for that. And if you stick around, you'll learn what it is. To begin, the earliest examples of threads were made from natural fibers like sinew from animals, plant fibers, and animal hair. The early humans were really resourceful in using what they had to create garments for their comfort and protection and also for style. You remember from the pins and needles episode that needles and awls had been found 70,000 years ago. They also used thread or their version of thread to stitch those garments together. We can also look back at certain civilizations and connect them to particular fibers based on their region. So when we think about the ancient Egyptians, for example, they were pioneers in linen threads, whereas the Chinese developed silk threads through the use of silkworms, which were native and very plentiful in that region. And so I really appreciate how we can look at certain geographies and attach material histories to that. There's a wonderful podcast that talks about that, and it was called Black Maternal Geographies. And so do check that out. And we did a cross-promo episode a few years ago, and it was a great conversation. Today, when we think about threads and even some of the brands you might recognize, like Coats and Clark, these have origins in 19th century Scotland. There was the Clark family who was located in Paisley, Ireland, and they worked to make thread that much more easy to produce and mechanize. There were the Coates family and the Clark family, both of them in Scotland, and both independently coming together to make thread under the brand that became Coats and Clark. Those families, those businesses became known and really ramped up during the Industrial Revolution because they mechanized the production of thread, as opposed to having it be hand-loomed or hand-spun with less mechanized means. This is one of the advantages that we found in thread production during the Industrial Revolution. Another innovation that we see in the production of thread from the 19th century is mercerization. And that is a process that you take threads through when you run them through this caustic solution, and it makes them more permeable to dyes, and it gives them a bit more sheen and makes them stronger. And we still use mercerized threads today, but there's lots of other finishes for threads that we'll talk about when we talk about how do you make a thread. So let's get into that. How is thread made? The constitutive elements of thread are called ply, P-L-Y. It's the same kind of level, or you could imagine a 1-ply or 2-ply toilet paper. That's something we think about when we imagine ply. But the ply of a thread refers to the number of component strands that are twisted together to make the thread. So if you have a 2-ply thread, that's made from 2 individual strands that are twisted together. Twist is another term that's important for the production of thread. It's the action, as you might imagine, a twist, is when you twist short fibers or continuous filaments to produce thread. Twist gives the thread strength and flexibility. And without twist, The individual fiber strands would separate as they pass through the needle or fabric. And also, I think the twist as well as the thread finishing, which we'll finish up with next, really helps you to understand how a thread will work for you. So we'll talk about this when we talk about how do you choose a thread. If you've ever had to clean out the bobbin case of your sewing machine and found a lot of dust bunnies down in there, it is likely that that is from your thread. It can be from your fabric if you're working with a fabric that you know kind of leaves a lot of residue, but especially if you're cleaning out your machine and you notice dust through your thread guides and things like that, that is because your thread, the finishing of it is not as smooth as it should be or not as smooth as it could be. Now, I'm going to wrap up this section about how to make thread or what thread is when I talk about some processes that happen during the thread creation. And these are finishes. You might begin with something and you're spinning or twisting these fibers together, but in order for them to last, in order for them to have what's called tensile strength, like to be strong enough to be pulled on, it's going to have to be finished in some process. And these are all chemical processes that have been scientifically determined to improve the life of a thread. So the first one I mentioned already is mercerization, named after a man named James Mercer. And in this one, cotton thread is treated in a caustic solution that increases its, what they say, affinity for dyeing and adding strength to it. It also gives them a little bit of gloss, which I thought was interesting. The second process of thread finishing is to gas it. It's called gassed, Gassed, and that's when you pass thread through a flame at a high rate of speed to reduce the fuzz and produce a higher sheen. There are some threads that you want to be really shiny. They come in rayon, they come in viscose, they come in polyester. All of these, though, have the single objective is to produce a certain look when stitched out. These are embroidery threads. The last one I'll mention, the last finish that I'll mention is bonded. And that is for continuous filament nylon or polyester thread. These threads get treated with a special resin that adds to the thread's ability to resist abrasion. This is how you can get threads that are called invisible thread, which is really a very, very fine, thin monofilament similar to fishnet. Not fishnet, similar to fishing line, but it's very, very thin and very strong. The bonding process is the reason why the monofilament threads are so strong. We've talked about the history and the how of sewing threads, how they're made, and a little bit about the origins. Let's jump now into the different types of sewing machine thread. There are a lot. There are far many more types of sewing machine threads than I can adequately discuss in this episode. I could say there are about 25 different types. You only need to think about a few when you're getting started, and that's what I wanted to share today. There's 4 different types of thread, and we're going to go into each of them. The first type is a polyester. The second type is cotton. The third is heavy duty, and the fourth is specialty. These are things that we'll discuss in some pretty good detail coming up right now. Polyester thread. People love polyester thread because of its strength, its elasticity, the way that it resists shrinkage and mildew. Polyester is very good for general purpose sewing. You will find it a lot in all-purpose thread, which leads me to my recommendation. If you are just getting started and you're not sure what you want to sew, get all-purpose thread. It is the thread that, for your purposes as a beginner, will meet all the purposes you need. I've been sewing for 30 years and still use all-purpose thread for the majority of my sewing. I do have other threads, but all-purpose is exactly that. It works well for all of the purposes that you might imagine. Are you sewing a quilt? Are you piecing the blocks together? Are you quilting the layers? You can do that with all-purpose thread. Are you making a pair of jeans and you want to put the garment together, but you also want to do some top stitching along the hem? The all-purpose thread will do that, though we'll talk about a few better options for denim. Are you working on lingerie or bras or craft projects? Are you making tote bags and flags? All-purpose threads will be good for those projects too. So just remember, all-purpose thread is largely going to be polyester. And that is because cotton thread, which was the original or one of the original threads that's used in home sewing here in the US, was modernized by the rise of polyester in about the 1950s. And then using polyester thread as part of apparel construction became a reality in 1955 when it became a thread. So polyester seems to have won out, and we have lots of polyester everywhere today. And in the sewing community, it shows up in the fabrics, the fibers, and definitely in the threads. To shift to cotton thread, this is ideal for natural fabrics. Cotton thread is soft, it has minimal stretch. It is a favorite for those who are doing heirloom sewing, especially heirloom quilting. Folks love the cotton thread because the cotton thread goes well with the cotton fabrics used in the quilt top. So it's about compatibility, making sure that your thread and your fabric are aligned. I want to take this opportunity as we're talking about cotton thread to give a shout out to friend of the pod, Aurifil. Aurifil has been a great support of Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast. And luckily for us also, they make extraordinarily fine thread. And I say fine because it's amazing. And they've got lots of different weights and varieties. But what I want to talk to you about is the cotton variety that is the 50 weight. It looks like a rayon. It feels like a rayon. It is so shiny. It is so smooth and 100% cotton. It comes in 270 colors. And what I want to lift up in particular is that Aurifil has created collections with Black makers. They create collections with all types of makers, but the ones I want to amplify today are the ones that they have done with Black folks. That includes Threads of Diversity with the Social Justice Sewing Academy. It includes Roots with E. Bond, Porphyria, A Quilty Life, and Aronica Cole in her Rustic Chic collection. We had an episode about that and talked about it. And y'all, the threads are really great. I am not just saying this because they're a friend of the pod. They're a friend of the pod because they have amazing stuff, right? So do check them out. I'm going to include the links to the thread collections that I just mentioned if you are interested in some high quality cotton thread. It is available from Aurifil. Hey friends, hey, I know you're enjoying the audio version of Stitch Please, and thanks so much for listening. But you're missing out on all the great stuff going on behind the scenes. That's why I'm inviting you to join our Black Women Stitch Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can see all the video versions of the podcast. Plus, you get some amazing swatch cards. You know how much I love these swatch cards. Look, see how cool these are? Oh wait, you can't see them because you are not yet on the Patreon. So when you join the Patreon, you'll be able to see this, me showing you these amazing cards. We also have some great perks at the other tiers, like discounts, swag, office hours, and more. Don't be the last sewist in the group now. Head over to patreon.com/blackwomenstitch or click the link in the show notes and become a Patreon supporter today. We truly cannot do this without you. So thank you so much. The other two types of thread that I want to go over are heavy duty thread and then other specialty threads. I've talked about polyester, which is what you're going to be using for your all-purpose sewing or all-purpose thread if you choose all-purpose thread, but you can also choose cotton thread, and that is available from Aurifil as well as from lots of different companies. What you'll want to look out for is how it runs on your machine. Does it leave a lot of lint? that's something that you'll also want to pay attention to. When it comes to heavy duty thread, you'll want to use this when you're working with tough projects or very dense fabric. Things like denim, depending on how many layers of denim you're using, you can use a heavy duty thread. If you're working with canvas, even things that might be wax coated, upholstery, very densely concentrated fibers, particularly woven ones, you will want to use heavy duty thread for these. I often see heavy duty thread in the line of button threads as well. When you are attaching a button, you can use a heavy duty thread, but they'll also make a specialty thread that is good for heavy duty sewing as well, which we can get to in the specialty section. But the heavy duty thread is designed to make sure your pieces stay sewn together, right? You aren't going to be able to sew it's not going to last very long if you are sewing a heavy fabric with a fine or thin thread. It might look nice, maybe it might even look invisible, but your garments are meant to move. The fabrics are going to rub up against other fabrics. They're going to rub up against themselves. All these different abrasions, all of these things are what, when you sit down on furniture, there's lots of different ways that the fabrics of your clothes get agitated throughout its lifespan. And the thread is something that gets agitated from the inside out. Your body is on the inside of it, rubbing around with, your fabric and the tensions in your legs and going up and down and sitting and using the stairs and all of that. And then the fabric on the outside is exposed to the environment. So all is to say, there are situations in which having a heavy duty thread will be useful, including for jeans, hems, jeans, top stitching on the side seams, because there's a lot of stress in that area. Especially when you want the top stitching to show, it's also good to have a heavy duty thread for that. It's also important to note now, as we're going to pivot to specialty threads, that there are special threads made for sewing denim, made for sewing jeans. They have the same colors that a lot of popular ready-to-wear jeans have. They even have some that are like glitter and just really incredible. So specialty threads are a lot of fun, and you can decide how much you're willing to play around with your thread choices if you want to get into specialty threads. That they have metallic threads, elastic threads, glow-in-the-dark threads. There are threads, they're basting threads that you can put in the bobbin of your sewing machine and baste something together and then remove the basting with water. There is a heat-soluble thread that you can do the same thing. Press it, and the stitches disappear. These are examples of specialty threads. You can use these for decorative stitching, like beautiful rayon threads or, extra heavy cording or whatever. You can use glow-in-the-dark threads if you wanted to stitch a message into a quilt or a kid's name or something, and it showed up at night. That could be kind of fun. I definitely have some glow-in-the-dark threads here. And when I'm in the dark in the sewing room, like if, I'm leaving the room or coming in and it's dark, I can look over and see a little tiny Lego ghost that one of the boys gave me when they were little, and a couple of spools of thread that are still retaining their glow-in-the-dark properties after all this time. But specialty threads can really bring your creativity to life. I do want to add this caveat. The threads themselves are not magic. They must be used in conjunction with the best needles for the project. The needle and thread, they really go hand in hand. And then you also have to consider the fabric that you're using, the speed at which you're sewing. There's lots of different variables when you are working with specialty threads. So I am not saying this to discourage you. In fact, it's the opposite. I'm saying it to encourage you. Find out how your machine works well with these threads. Experiment. Swap out different threads for different needles. Change the stitch length on your sewing machine to see if that makes a difference. Sew a little slower or a little faster. Change your stitch pattern. All of these are ideas to just get you to practice. You should already have a bunch of fabric already. If you've made anything, you have some leftovers. And if you have listened to the episodes on the scrap cushion or why you should have, I think the episode is called Sewing from the Trash, and it's about my box of sewing fabric offcuts. Only fabric goes in there. So I can always reach in and pull out a variety of materials to practice and say, oh, this looks really great on this denim. Ugh, this looks really terrible on this spandex. So just give yourself permission to play, give yourself permission to fail. That's how you learn. If you don't make any mistakes, how are you going to grow? And that leads us into choosing the right thread. This is an important part of the process. And as I just mentioned, the compatibility between needle and thread is important, but so is the fabric type. You'll want to match your thread to your fabric, and that will mean using polyester thread for synthetic fabrics and cotton thread for natural fabrics. I think that just makes sense. You can use polyester thread in natural fabrics, but honestly, if you're going through all the trouble to sew with natural fabrics, and that's something that really means a lot to you, it's not going to hurt to use cotton thread. I think that would be really a lovely way to bring the garment to wholeness, you know? Again, these are just recommendations. You can do whatever you want. Think about the project type as well for your thread when you're selecting your thread. Is it going to be a high demand type thing? Are you making a sofa cushion that's going to be sat on by a bunch of people? Or is it a very light veil that you're only going to use once? These are the questions you'll want to imagine as you're trying to consider thread. At the same time, y'all, all these project types, the fabric types, all-purpose thread should work for a good percentage of them. If you want to think about the finish. What is the final look and feel that you want for your project? Do you want it to stand out? Do you want it to have something unique? Do you want it to have some kind of metallic sheen or some kind of, so a little bit more depth and complexity than just regular cotton thread or regular polyester thread? Then choose a thread that does that. And again, this is, shout out to friend of the pod, but Aurifil has some gorgeous cottons that have such luster. It's just really stunning. So do check them out. The link will be in the show notes, but they have a really great finish on their threads that give it a really nice look. That's why a lot of quilters really like Aurifil threads. You also want to think about the weight of your thread. How much density does it have? How big are the holes are you going to make when you're sewing your seam? There's a way, for example, when you're making jeans, so you're going to do that inseam stitch that you find on a lot of ready-to-wear jeans. You can do that with an all-purpose thread, but it will look better if you did it with a denim thread. You don't then, at the same time, want to sew your jeans with a denim thread. The denim is designed for a top stitch and decorative effect. If you want the same color or, typically you want the seams to not show, so you might even do it in the same color. It doesn't need to be that heavy in order to be effective. I want to talk also about one last element when you're thinking about thread. Think about how much do you need? How much do you need? And this is a question of thread consumption. Thread comes in a variety of measurements. You can get a spool that's 100 meters or 110 yards. You can get one that's 225 yards. You can get it that's 1,000 yards. You can get cones that are 5,000 yards. How much do you need, however, in order to get started? I recommend getting a variety pack of whatever brand of thread you like or want to try. I do have some recommendations in the Black Women Stitch Amazon page. Whatever variety you want to try, and get it in a variety of colors. That is going to cover you a lot. But I did also find a thread consumption chart. And I'm just going to give you a few of these measurements. This is from the Coates and Clark company, the Coates company. I think it's from their industrial side, but I'll put the link in the show notes so you can look at it too. They're saying that for a blouse, or what they would call like a woman's maybe short sleeve shirt, that's 100 meters. And that's about a spool of a skinny, tall spool. If you're making a raincoat, it's 285 meters. You're making a men's shirt, it's 120 meters. You're making a pair of ladies' pants or men's pants, that's 30 to 35 meters. All of these things are estimates. I thought it was kind of cool to be able to say, oh, if I'm making a pair of men's jeans, I'll need 210 meters of thread. You typically think about thread consumption when you are doing embroidery. Embroidery designs are measured by the stitches, the number of stitches. So there's a design that's 75,000 stitches. You'll want to know what size thread spool to get so that you don't run out during the stitch out of the design. Wrapping up, I want to talk about thread maintenance and storage. And this is why your grandma was right to store those sewing threads in that cookie tin. I think that there's a way that sewing thread can be stored in a variety of ways. I am in a room with not very much natural light. And so because it's also in the basement, it's rather dark. I have mine on the wall, and some of them are wrapped so that the ends don't come loose, but others of them are not. And it has been fine. They have not been overly exposed. But the thing you want to remember is that you should keep your threads in a cool, dry place away from direct sunlight. That is a priority. The effect of light on thread is significant for both cotton thread and polyester thread, believe it or not. Cotton thread is, of course, more susceptible because of the UV rays. It can cause fibers to weaken and become brittle over time. So that's why you want to store your cotton thread away from sunlight. It helps it to, just stay healthy longer. Polyester thread, which you imagine, them twins, Polly and Esther, are indestructible. But they can have some type of damage as well if they have prolonged exposure to sunlight. And so why not go ahead and store all your threads in a cool, dark place when you're not using them? Now, for some people, they don't have a lot of cool, dark places in their house. But if you get a cookie tin as a gift and you eat all the cookies and you enjoy them very much, then you put your threads in that tin, and guess what it becomes? A cool, dry place away from direct sunlight. See? It's a cool, dry place away from direct sunlight. That is why you put them in the cookie tin. Isn't that genius? That's a great idea. So thank y'all so much for listening to today's episode. We talked about thread today. We talked a little bit about its history, about how it's made, thinking about the different types of thread and how you can choose the ones that work best for your projects. Let me know what you think. I want to hear from you. Are there other thread questions that you have? Drop me a line on SpeakPipe. You can leave me a message up to 5 minutes long, and I will listen to it, and I will call you back. Connect with me on SpeakPipe. There's a link in the show notes, and I will SpeakPipe you back. That means I will leave you a message back in return. Thank you all so much for being here. Come back next time and we'll help you get your stitch together.
You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.